Hi everyone, my name is Martin Ho Kwan Ip. I'm a postdoc working with Anna Papaflago at the University of Pennsylvania. And today I'm going to tell you about some of our research looking at the role of non-native speech signals in listeners' social pragmatic inferences and social evaluations. For a long time, foreign accents have often been thought to carry many disadvantages. From a social standpoint, accented speakers face various kinds of discrimination in many settings, in the workplace, in dating, and this is very much reflected in decades of survey studies across cultures where non-native speakers are, in general, considered less trustworthy, less reliable, and even less morally upright. Interestingly, even very early in life, young children and sometimes pre-verbal infants are less likely to make friends with and learn from social partners who speak to them in a foreign accent. So these findings not only show that we have a very negative attitude towards non-native speakers, but that accent serves a very important social cue in the language input that determines listeners' social perception and behavioral intentions. So why do we have such a negative attitude towards non-native speakers? One widely cited proposal is based on how we process foreign accents. There are many perceptual challenges associated with accented speech. Accented speech is, for one, highly unfamiliar, but it's also less intelligible in that it contains phonetic segments that deviates from native speech and has very different prosodic contours and speech rates, all of which we as listeners use to make sense of the speech stream. And the processing demands that accents impose can often make non-native speakers appear less believable. For instance, Levali and Kisa found that trivia statements like "ants don't sleep" are rated as less likely to be true when they are produced by a non-native speaker compared to a native speaker. And in support of the processing cost hypothesis, they also found that these statements were less believable when they were produced by a severely accented speaker compared to a mildly accented non-native speaker. But syntactic errors are also ignored when we process for non-native speech, and information omissions are less likely to be penalized in non-native speakers compared to native speakers. For instance, when we read underinformative sentences like "some elephants have trunks," we tend to rate them better when we think they come from a non-native speaker. And part of the reason for this is because underinformativeness is more likely to be attributed to inability in non-native speakers, whereas in native speakers, it's more likely to be due to unwillingness. So these effects really arise because we as listeners prejudge non-native speakers to be less linguistically competent and more error-prone, and we take into account of these expectations in a top-down manner when we make sense of the speech input. But one question that still needs to be addressed is whether non-native speech signals themselves are enough to affect pragmatic interpretation. And this is a question that I'm going to address in this talk. So to see whether there really is a non-native advantage in the pragmatic domain, we examined how people evaluate native and non-native speakers when they are being informative or underinformative in spoken communication. We used speech stimuli, and we created a scenario in which information omission can be linked to deception. All participants in our study watched a short video clip containing a story in which a woman entered a ransacked mansion and called the owner to tell her about the robbery. The picture you see here on your left is from the final scene in the kitchen where we manipulated the character's informativeness. So here the woman told the owners that the robbers either left some apples and money or just said left some apples. Throughout the story, we also manipulated the woman's speaker identity, whether she spoke with a native North American English accent, or whether she was a non-native speaker, but with no syntactic errors, so that she was a rather proficient non-native speaker, or whether she was a non-native speaker, but with many syntactic errors. All these speech recordings were recorded by the same speaker, and these differences were later confirmed by intelligibility ratings, where non-native speakers were rated as less intelligible compared to the native speaker. So in this and the following slides, I'm going to show you our stimuli. Please first watch the story where the character is a native speaker.
Hello, Mrs. Jenkins. I have bad news. Someone came to your house. They broke everything. Your things are gone. I'm in the kitchen. They took everything.
Oh, they left some apples and money.
Or she's being underinformative and says,
Oh, they left some apples.
Here, I would like to show you the same story, but this time the woman is a non-native speaker with many syntactic errors.
Hello, Mrs. Jenkins. Me's having bad news. Someone came into your house. They've broken everything. Your things
Gone.
Me in kitchen. They took all things.
And in the final scene where we manipulated her informativeness,
Oh, they left some apples and money. Oh, they left some apples.
So after watching the story, listeners rated the woman in terms of various intellectual and social dimensions. They first rated how competent they think the woman in the story is. They then rated how honest they think the woman is and her likelihood of being a good witness to the police. We combined her honesty and witness potential ratings to compute her level of trustworthiness. Participants also rated the woman in terms of her likability and their likelihood of being friends with the woman, which we combined to form interpersonal appeal. We would like to note that these traits were selected based on previous studies showing their robust role in social perception and behavior. So for all these traits, we predict that underinformative speakers will be penalized compared to informative speakers. But crucially, these effects will depend on the speaker's native or non-native status. If the processing cost hypothesis is correct, that accents impose an intelligibility challenge, which leads listeners to form negative attitudes towards non-native speakers, then social penalties will be greater in non-native speakers, especially for the non-native speaker with many syntactic errors. But if social pragmatic context and the different attributions of underinformativeness matters, then social penalties will be mitigated in non-native speakers. So turning to the results, for competence, underinformative speakers were rated as less competent compared to informative speakers. But this occurred regardless of the speaker's native or non-native status. I note here that the higher numbers indicate lower ratings, so for instance 7 here is extremely incompetent and 1 is extremely competent. For trustworthiness, the effects were also the same. Underinformative speakers were rated as more untrustworthy compared to informative speakers, but importantly, these effects were less so for non-native speakers. So when the speaker was a native speaker and was being underinformative, participants rated her as quite untrustworthy, but these effects were mitigated for the underinformative non-native speakers. So this shows that being a non-native speaker presents some social pragmatic advantage in how trustworthy you are being viewed, despite not telling the whole truth. For interpersonal appeal, the trend was also there, albeit non-significant. But nonetheless, we see a main effect of informativeness and speaker identity, where this time being underinformative and being a native speaker led to lower ratings of interpersonal appeal. We also asked participants who saw the underinformative speakers to justify why they think the woman in the story failed to mention the money. As you can see, the majority of the responses invoked unwillingness deception answers, like she wanted to keep the money. But importantly, such responses were still more likely in the native speaker compared to the non-native speaker. On the other hand, the non-native speaker was more likely to elicit inability justifications compared to the native speaker. So what we found here so far is that, at least for trustworthiness, listeners are more likely to be lenient towards the underinformative non-native speaker. But I note here that the story we provided here involves a very clear deception-oriented context involving money, which is a very frequent word and also a very important piece of information. So a remaining question is whether this non-native advantage we found could be generalized to a more ambiguous case of underinformativeness. So we addressed this question in a second experiment, where this time we replaced the large pile of cash with a crate of pineapples, and the woman either said they left some apples and pineapples or just said they left some apples. So here, not mentioning pineapples could be due to a number of reasons. The woman may like pineapples and omit pineapples due to selfish reasons and wanting to keep the pineapples for herself. But it could also be due to a lack of word knowledge, because pineapple is a very infrequent word according to the Coker corpus, and it's also lower in relevance compared to the wider context of the robbery. Here, what we found is that there were no differences in competence across both the informativeness conditions as well as in the speaker's native or non-native status. For interpersonal appeal, again, there were also no differences. But for trustworthiness, the effects still hold. Underinformative speakers were considered more untrustworthy compared to informative speakers, and the effects were less so for the non-native speakers. When participants were asked to justify the underinformativeness in the underinformative native and non-native speakers, here, majority of the responses involved inability answers, such as she didn't know the word pineapple. But importantly, such responses were more likely in the non-native speakers compared to the native speaker. And again, consistent with experiment 1, the native speaker was more likely to elicit unwillingness answers, such as she is planning to take the pineapples. So to conclude, overall, listeners rated underinformative speakers poorly compared to informative speakers. But importantly, underinformativeness sometimes led to different social evaluations depending on the speaker's identity. Contrary to previous studies, we found no global bias against non-native speakers. We would like to end here by talking about the role of processing accents and the social pros and cons of being a non-native speaker. Our data do not support the view that listeners form negative attitudes towards non-native speakers simply because accents impose intelligibility challenges. What we found here instead is that while non-native speakers were judged as less intelligible, they were still less likely to be penalized for being underinformative. So our data here supports the alternative view that intelligibility may only affect social judgments indirectly. What we found here is that non-native speakers are likely to be underinformative simply because listeners view them as less linguistically competent. And this lack of linguistic control could be the reason for why they were being underinformative, not due to their levels of untrustworthiness. But is this really a true advantage? We would like to argue for now that the social pragmatic advantage we found here for the non-native speakers is more akin to a negative cushioning effect, where a perceived lack of linguistic control leads listeners to think that non-native speakers are being underinformative only unintentionally. So these effects really arise because listeners expect non-native speakers to be error-prone. So for now, we conclude that foreign accents can bring unexpected social benefits in certain pragmatic contexts. Before I end, I would like to acknowledge financial support from the Integrated Language Sciences and Technology Initiative. And I would also like to thank Elena Papas for lending her voice for all the speech recordings. And I would also like to thank Gwendolyn Hildebrandt for letting us photograph her for the story. And also very importantly, we would like to acknowledge all of our lab members for their very helpful feedback. Thank you very much.